Hey guys, it's vf.miniatures Warhammer Tactics series. So today we're gonna talk about the Sons of Prospero, also known as the guys who did nothing wrong, and discuss how to use them in competitive play and how to win more games with them. So without further ado, let's dive right in. And as usual, first we're going to talk about the strength of a given force, and in this case, the Thousand Sons are the masters of the psychic phase. There is no other army that even closely, remotely compares to the level that Thousand Sons are at. Sorry, Grey Knights. They always have +1 to cast and have this system called Kabbalistic Rituals. Basically, you receive the certain amount of points for each of your characters, psychic characters and psychic units, and you can spend those points during your psychic phase in order to enhance your psychic abilities and, for example, manipulate the rolls that you've made on the casts. And the most important part is that you do that after casting. So, for example, you have missed the cast by 1 point. You've cast on a 5 where you need a 6. And you can just spend 5 Cabal points for the Kindred Sorcerers and do the cast even though you have just failed it. Also, you can make powers undeniable, add D3 mortal wounds to any witchfire, also add 2 to the cast for 9 Cabal points, and so on and so forth. Basically, these two things, the +1 to cast and the Kabbalistic Rituals, most importantly, make the Thousand Sons the kings of the psychic phase, which they are, because they have almost total control of what will and will not be cast. And if for some reason for a game plan you really need some power to go off, you can just spend those points and do that without even worrying about it. As a Grey Knights player, I can tell you that there is a very big difference between trying to cast on a true roll and only having a CP reroll in your pocket to save yourself and being able to manipulate the roll or sometimes not even do the dice roll. Just spend the 7 Cabal points and cast a power on a minimal level automatically. For example, if you have no denies in range and you don't fear that your power will be denied because you've rolled not so high, you don't need the high roll in that case. Their damage in the psychic phase is unparalleled and can delete entire units. Sometimes it's even scary to look at because when you think that the turn of the Thousand Sons player should have already ended, it's in reality only their psychic phase, and they have the shooting phase and the fight phase to look forward to. They have good inbuilt resilience thanks to the Brotherhood of Sorcerers ability that allows the whole army to have the 5+ invulnerable save everything from the mere troops, characters, tanks, hellbrutes, and etc. Always Dust is a nice rule that provides great protection against damage 1 weapons for your main infantry, that being Rubric Marines and the Scarpical Terminators. It basically adds +1 to your saving throw when you are attacked by damage 1 weapons, both ranged and in melee. They also obviously get the new Armor of Contempt, which I've talked about in my previous video, so attacking them with damage 1 weapons is nigh useless because, for example, Terminators will get a 0-up save against damage 1 weapons, so even a -3 attack will only bring them to a 3-up save. They can also -1 damage for the Unwavering Phalanx Stratagem. It's great, it's only problem that it costs 3 command points if the unit size is bigger than 5, but it's definitely worth it, especially for your big blobs of Terminators with 3 wounds when they get attacked with damage 3 weapons. It's a shame that you can't use that stratagem in melee, because that would be very, very important, but you'll have to deal with that some other way. Also, a nice bonus is that if you use Unwavering Phalanx against the damage to attack, it basically automatically activates the Allas Dust as well, so you will also get the +1 to a saving throw. Rubrics and the Scarpical Terminators are also fearless, so you don't have to fear that you will fail a morale test and your expensive models will run away. It's cool that the Games Workshop understands that in terms of the boys made of dust, but they somehow miss it when talking about the crazy murderous Death Company and Wolfen. Those still have some problems with their fear management. The Thousand Sons can have great speed if you choose the Cult of Duplicity as your great cult. It basically allows your whole psychic force to have access to a teleport psychic power the Sorcerer's Facade with the Warp Charge 8, so 7 with your +1 to cast. That great cult also allows you access to a redeploy warlord trait, which allows you to redeploy D3 units before the game, and the whole army has an access to a teleport relic called Umbrolithic Crystal. It acts basically like a veil, only difference being that you cannot teleport the bearer with the unit. You can only teleport the unit that is within 6 of him. The good old warp time, or as now it's called temporal surge, is still here. It unfortunately cannot be used on the monsters, so you can't use that on your Magnus, for example, your Demon Prince, but you can double move the cavalry and the infantry. And that's what we need to make our Terminators much more mobile and make them cross 10 inches instead of 5 per turn. And like the good old warp time, you can still charge after that, unlike the new double move psychic powers in the Eldari book. They also have cool infernal bolters which have AP2 on them, which provides a rare type of high volume, high AP shooting. I actually love the idea that Thousand Suns are not only cool because of their psychic potential, but they also have some interesting high AP bolters. They're not as great nowadays against Space Marines, of course, because of Armor of Contempt, but still not bad, and you can deal with a lot of stuff in the game with that sort of shooting. Their relics and traits are great and almost necessary to take a couple extra in each of your games. And their stratagem list is also great, as you'll see in the next sections of this video. Now a bit about their weaknesses. First of all, the melee isn't best in this army. They are obviously not dedicated melee fighters, but it's enough if you build the right list and use the army correctly. Also, there are no really charge modifications, so if you are teleporting to charge, you will be required to roll that true 9 to get in. To have necessary speed, you need to use Cult of Duplicity. There are some good cults out there also, but if you really want to win competitive games, you need mobility, you need to be able to redeploy, and you need speed. So you are basically tied to one cult, which is something that I don't like in any book where that happens. Unfortunately, in this case, it happened with 1,000 Suns because of the limitation of using the sub-faction keywords that we got in the previous chapter approved. Characters are the brain of this army. They provide the lion's share of the psychic powers and the cabal points, and you need 3 or 4 in each of your lists. Losing them is like losing most of your psychic output, and they are relatively squishy, those that aren't demon princes. Taking Abhor the Witch and Assassinate against 1,000 Suns is almost an auto take. Also, I mustn't forget about the elephant in the room, or the big red elephant, the Magnus the Red. He is pretty bad because he is 18 wounds, so he can't use Obscuring, you can't hide him behind terrain, which is incredibly stupid, as I think. And without the added resilience of Mortarion, he has little to no chance to survive against a good shooting army, and losing him prematurely is bad because he is a quarter of your army. Also, another weakness of 1,000 Suns is that I don't think they have enough models in the book to have variety. You are basically limited to a couple of builds to be competitive, and it's bad because rules are constantly changing, and if we lose some of the units or one of the units that we are constantly utilizing in our competitive lists, it will mean that our competitive lists are not longer viable, and we will need to wait until something else in the codex actually gets to be used. Unlike, for example, in the Space Marine codex, there are a lot of units that can be used competitively, so some are always available to be built in lists with. Now let's talk about the army composition. First of all, we need a backbone for our army. I always start building lists with that, something tough to shoot and get shot at, and preferably also fight for us. Demon engines are bad now, and I don't like them. They are too expensive, they don't do enough damage even with the new Armor of Contempt, and they don't have -1 damage like the Dreadnoughts do, so no rerolls, of course, because they are not core. I recommend to check out Forge World. First of all, the Leviathan Dreadnought with Meltus, or 2, or a Drill, if you want him to be a universal, not only shoot, but also fight. And of course, Volkites as a secondary weapon, because they're much better than Heavy Flamers. Also, the good old Contemptor with Volkites and Cyclone Missile Launcher is pretty efficient with 1000 Suns because you have one command point encircled infusion stratagem, which basically allows you to have extra AP on your weapons if there is a sorcerer nearby the Dreadnought. Hellbrutes aren't bad either. Meltas and Fists are the best configuration for them. They have core, they have decent shooting, decent melee, 5 up and 1 because of the Brotherhood of Sorcerers, and a respectable price of 120 points. Then we move on to the workhorses, the units that do the most damage and interactions with the enemy. The Scaraboccal Terminators are the best option for that. They are relatively tough, not as tough as the Blight Lords or the Deathwing, of course, but they have 1-up save because of the Armor of Contempt, always dust. The Unwavering Phalanx for -1 damage, Glamour of Zinch for -1 to hit, so they can be relatively tough. And they have damage to basically mastercrafted power swords, which makes them relatively efficient in melee. They all have 3 attacks, and the sorcerer has also 3 attacks with his staff. And their storm models, as I already said, have AP2 and good volume of shooting at 24 inches or sometimes even further than that. You can deal with a lot of elite stuff with your mortal wound output, you can deal with some vehicles, monsters with your dreadnoughts, melters and etc. But you need some volume of shooting in each of your lists, and with this the Terminators help tremendously. Now we move on to the HQ slots, and as previously mentioned, it's one of the most important parts of your roster. All the characters we have access to are great, the only limiting factor in this case are the HQ slots. You should always have Ahriman, that's the rule, he's almost awesome, and we will talk about him in detail a bit later. The Exalted Sorcerers are basically your captain slash librarians. They have a typical Chaos Lord stat line of 5 wounds, 4 up and 1, 3 up save. They can also have discs, which are basically a fancy jump pack. And another cool thing about them is with the Thrall rule, you can basically get a free sorcerer in each of your detachments for each of your exalted sorcerers. And it's very important to cram as many sorcerers and psychers into one battalion detachment as possible. The Demon Prince is expensive, but he's definitely worth it for extra speed, resilience, and melee support. His psychic output is equivalent to an exalted sorcerer, so you're basically paying for his bulky, muscly frame. The Infernal Masters are great, they're basically like your chaplain and librarian in one package. They can cast 1 power and they can recite a pact. And those packs are very useful. 2 of my favorite ones are a free reroll of any dice that is non-mission specific. So, for example, you can reroll 1 dice that you've rolled for a charge roll or psychic test. And +1 strength on your ranged attacks can be very useful with Warp Flamers or the good old Inferno Bolters. In terms of troops, your choice is pretty easy. You should take as many MSUs of rubrics as you can until you run out of points, and then you can take a single Zangor squad, for example, to hold your home objective. You can also experiment with like 10-man units of rubrics with flamers, but those are pretty expensive, though they can get through a lot of enemies. So that's up to you. Now let's discuss the special characters. First of all, the Ahriman, and as I say here, he's simply the best, better than all the rest. Because he casts 3 powers, he denies 3, he rerolls his psychic tests for free, which is incredible, especially when you give him something difficult like a Warp Charge 7 or 8 power. He has a good stat line with 6 wounds, 4 up and 1, 5 attacks with his Black Staff Ahriman, with strength 7, AP 1 and damage 3. You can give him a disc for the 12-inch move. He is also, like any good exalted sorcerer should, gives out a 6-inch aura of reroll once to hit, and he can be added to any cult without breaking the detachment, which is very important. The only drawback with Ahriman that I can see is that he doesn't have the Great Cult keyword, therefore he can't be used for the Thrall rule. So when you take Ahriman, you are basically limited to having 5 sorcerers in your army. Ahriman, the 2 sorcerers that you can take with the battalion detachment, the exalted ones, and 2 regular sorcerers that you can take without taking up the detachment slot. The situation gets even harder if you want to include the Infernal Master, because then you have Ahriman, you have Infernal Master, and only 1 exalted sorcerer, so you can only take 1 extra regular sorcerer for your powers. So in this case, you can't even take the Demon Prince because you will have no space for him in your battalion detachment. Of course, you can go for the patrol and have 4 HQ slots, which solves a lot of problems, but you are gonna spend 2 command points to do that, which is not great. The Thousand Suns, as any good psychic power should, they spend relatively many command points, not as much as the Grey Knights do, because these guys have a lot of ways to gain command points, unlike the Grey Knights. But still, I prefer not to spend extra CPs before the game because I need them in the game. And quite possibly the best thing about Ahriman, he costs 160 points or 180 with the disc. It's incredible. He is like Trajan Valoris, but from the chaos side of the spectrum. And now the difficult part. It's Magnus the Red. Obviously, he's a Primarch, so he's automatically badass. If you like the model, I think you should absolutely have him in your collection, because the sculpt is amazing. But it doesn't help him to be competitive, because his 4-1, -1 damage, 18 wounds and -1 to hit from the Glamour aren't enough to keep him alive long enough to make his points back. So it's a very real possibility that you will lose him before he actually gets to do something, and it's very, very bad, because you have no way to hide him, no real practical way at least. Because putting him in the strategic reserves is bad. You're gonna spend 3 command points on that. You will not be able to use him for a whole turn, so quarter of your army will be off the table, and you will be fighting with less forces. So it begs the question, why do you even take him in the first place when there are more efficient units in the book? It's very sad, but it's unfortunately true. Psychically, he's obviously the king. He casts 3 powers, denies 3. He has an inbuilt +3 to cast if you include the Brotherhood of Sorcerers buff. He rerolls all his denies and casts. He knows all the powers he has access to. He ignores perils. He smites D6 automatically and 3d3 if it's a super smite, and a super smite is very easy for him to do. In melee, he's not bad. He has 8 attacks at strength 16, AP 4 and damage 3, and he does mortal wounds if he didn't kill the squad, but he's not great actually. He should have been damage 4, I think, to be able to go toe-to-toe with units of his stature. He has a 16-inch move and fly, and basically the only thing that is limiting him from being used actually in games is the 18 wounds that he has. If he had 17 wounds, it would be absolutely correct and great, and he would be absolutely usable because you would be able to hide him at least for 1 turn of the game. Now let's talk about the secondaries. We have access to 4, which is unusual. Usually codexes have access to only 3 of these secondaries, and there are some good here and some that are geared towards fighting another psychic heavy army. I really like Warpcraft Mutate Landscape. It's a basic psychic action on an objective marker. You can do that on any objective marker that has not been mutated yet, and each time you do that, the warp charge of the psychic action increases by 1, and for each objective marker that you have mutated, you get 3 victory points at the end of the game. Very easy and very useful to have in your pocket. I like this one much more than the Purifying Ritual of the Grey Knights, because there you need to do the psychic action on many objectives at once to score the points. Here you only need to sacrifice 1 unit to score those victory points that you need. Much more convenient. Next one is the Anti-Psyker one. It's basically your option for the Abhor the Witch. Even though you have Psykers obviously in your force, you get 5 victory points for each psychic character that you kill and 3 victory points for each psychic unit that you kill. So if you're playing against Thousand Suns or Grey Knights, it's a great secondary to use. Shadow Operations Burn Empires is a much harder and much less useful version of the Mutate Landscape. I don't really like it because it requires you to make an action, not a psychic action, so you can't really do anything else with that unit in this turn, whereas psychic action is not that restrictive. You get more victory points for each action that you complete, but to be honest, the risks and the difficulties are not worth it. Plus, you can't do that on your home objective marker, and you need to be on that objective marker until the start of your next command phase. So the enemy has the whole turn, their own turn, to get you off that objective. And the last but not least is the No Mercy No Respite Wrath of Magnus. It's a great secondary because if your opponent has at least one psychic unit, you score 3 victory points at the end of the battle round if you killed more enemy models in your psychic phase than they did in their psychic phase, which is obviously incredibly easy for the Thousand Suns to do. Other secondaries I can recommend is obviously the Psychic Interrogation, especially if you took the Wrath of Magnus, you cannot take another secondary from the Thousand Suns book, so the Mutate landscape is close to you, so the Psychic Interrogation is good, especially if you have a character in your force that can only cast one power, like Infernal Master for example. It's a great secondary to have. Good 9 to 12 points can be scored, sometimes even 15 if you have done everything correctly. And obviously bring it down an assassination from the Purge the Enemy category and from the Battlefield Supremacy category, my favorite Stranglehold. If you have enough speed, the Stranglehold can be relatively easy to achieve in each of your turns and the opponent is very unlikely to stop you. Now my favorite section of each of these videos, these synergies. It's where all the things that we've talked about come together and form a fist that will punch through the enemy's forces. So with our 10-man Terminator blob, I recommend to use 1 CP for the Infernal Fusillade to add extra 10 shots to the initial 40 that you have with 10 Stormbolters, and with 2 command points for the Wrath of the Wronged, you get +1 to wounds on that attack. You can obviously use the stratagem also in the fight phase, which I highly recommend with those Strength 5 power swords. And with the Warp Charge 7 pre-stage, you can get +1 to hit on those Terminators, reroll on 1s for the Exalted Sorcerer, so you will be hitting on 2s, reroll on 1s, and wounding with +1 to wound, which can deal with a lot of targets very efficiently. And you can further boost that with Infernal Master's Malefic Maelstrom for the Strength 5 on the Bolters, which is obviously awesome, considering that you already have +1 to wound from the Wrath of the Wronged. Don't forget to use 1 CP for the Malignant Pact on the key turn where you actually need that Strength 5 really badly, because it basically allows you to deal D3 mortal wounds to a nearby infantry unit to the Infernal Master, but you get the pact off automatically for that. And you can also extend the range of those Stormbolters with Warp Charge for Empiric Guidance by 6 inches, so they will be 30-inch Infernal Bolters. Also, a unit like that is a great deterrent from deep striking units because of 2 CP Inescapable Forewarning, which basically allows you to shoot at the unit that came from deep strike within 18 inches of a Psyker and a unit that you've chosen to shoot with, for example, Terminators. So the Psyker needs to be within 6 of the unit, and both the Psyker and the unit need to be within 18 of the Deep Striker. Just imagine a unit of 15 neophyte hybrids of the Genestealer cults getting shot by 40 bolter shots from the Terminator blob. It's not very pleasant for them. You can use the Umbrellific Crystal or the Warp Charge 8 Sorcerer's Facade to teleport your Terminators around the board and get them to the safest spot with the required line of sight. Next up is a setup for the Demon Prince. Wings are a must take, even though they cost 35 points. It's absolutely worth it because of 12-inch move and fly. His Warlord trait and relic must be geared towards survivability, so the Undying Form for -1 damage and Conniving Plate for +2+ save and halving the enemy melee attacks that target the Demon Prince. Hellforged Sword, obviously, because you need as much AP as possible to utilize Warp Charge 8 Twist of Fate, and we can use Swell by the Warp Psychic Power to add +1 to our attack and add 2 to our Strength, making our Demon Prince Strength 10, AP 3, and Damage 3 with 6 attacks. If you like your enemies well done and fried to a fine crisp, and there's no better way to do that than a 10-man Rubric Marine squad with Warp Flamers. And with a Warp Charge 5 Prick Flux Psychic Power, you can get those Warp Flamers to Strength 5, AP 2, and Damage 1. With 2 CP Risen Rubricae, you can position that squad closer to the enemy before the game, even without spending your teleport power or relic. Another thing I really like about the Thousand Suns book is the Legion Command table of upgrades for your characters, and 2 of my favorites are the Dilettante 35-point upgrade that allows you to get an extra relic on your character, so you can have 2 relics on 1 character, which is incredible, and it brings the maximum amount of relics in your roster to 4, which is great, and you sometimes need that. And also the Rihati for 25 points, it's a flat extra cast on your Psyker, also great. Basically, it allows you to cast a smite always in addition to your 2 selected spells. Here are some stratagems that I recommend to remember always when you're playing Thousand Suns. 1 CP Malefic Scroll allows you to make a flat 3 Mortal Wound Smite. The only problem is that you must use the stratagem before rolling, so you don't know if you have rolled the Super Smite, for example, so the Super Smite will be wasted in this case. And 1 CP Masters of the Immaterium to simply ignore the perils in any case where you have suffered perils, which is great. 1 CP Warp Regeneration to heal D3 wounds on the model that made a cast on a true 9, or possibly even revive a model if there are no wounded models in the squad. And lastly, the Great Sorcerer 1 command point stratagem that is basically a typical cast extra power with the character stratagem that Grey Knights have, Blood Angels have. Basically any army that is geared towards psychic powers has a stratagem like that. Now let's quickly run through the relics. The Umbralific Crystal is a relic that allows you to teleport an infantry unit within 6 of the barrier. We've already talked about this one. It's a non-essential relic if you run Cult of Duplicity, and absolutely essential one if you're running a different cult, which I don't recommend. Next up is the Helm of the Demon's Eye. It's a typical 5-up command point regain for enemy using the stratagems. It's essential if you don't plan to use echoes from the Warp Kabbalistic Ritual that allows you to do a psychic action with any unit and gain a command point, and non-essential otherwise. Next is the Athenian Scrolls. It's a relic only for the Exalted Sorcerers, and it allows you to select one of the various spells and roll 3d6, discarding the lowest each time you cast it until the end of the battle. A great relic, especially if you use it for the Warp Charge 7 or 8 stuff like the Temporal Surge or Twist of Fate. It's non-essential, but a good thing to have if you have spare command points. Next is Eglagan's Orrery. The relics in the Thousand Suns book are some real tongue twisters. It's a 6-inch aura of ignoring hit, wound, and damage modification for core units that target a selected enemy unit. You basically select an enemy unit in your command phase, and it's doomed until the start of your next command phase. And each time you make an attack in melee and shooting both, you ignore all those negative modifiers, and the damage modification, so basically the Dreadnought ability, is also one of those, which is incredible, especially when using your damage 2 power swords against something like Blight Lords or Dreadnoughts. So basically an essential relic in my opinion. Next is, help me God Emperor, it's Thridergeir, the crazy disc of Zinch. It allows the bearer to fall back and cast and advance and charge. Also consolidate 6 inches in any direction. Great relic if you want to build a crazy melee exalted sorcerer. It's one of the things that I really want to do in some day, but not essential at all. And the next and the last one that I want to talk about is the Conniving Plate that I've already mentioned. A great armor set and absolutely essential for the Demon Prince. The Thousand Suns book has a lot of good, interesting relics like weapons, some sets of armor, but all those are some that you probably won't take in any of your games if you really want to make your list competitive, because you need those command points elsewhere. Now let's quickly run through the roster example. I have a Sorcerer, Ahriman, and 2 Exalted Sorcerers here. For the relics, I've chosen the Helm of the Demon's Eye and the Eglagan's Orrery. Their psychic powers are listed here. I will not read them, only say that Ahriman has the most difficult ones, because he has a free reroll, obviously. For troops, I have chosen 3 units of 5 Rubric Marines. For elites, it's a Chaos Contemptor with Volkites and a Cyclone Missile Launcher, and a Chaos Leviathan Dreadnought with Meltas and Volkite Calibers. I have 3 Hellbrutes here with Fists and Meltas, and 1 big blob of Scarabaccal Terminators with Hellfire Missile Racks, and they have a temporal Surge psychic power on them as well. And obviously this list starts with 9 command points because Zinch, and it has nothing to do with me spending a couple for the Dreadnoughts and Relics. And if you have been a very attentive viewer, you have also noticed that this presentation has exactly 9 unique slides. So this video is Zinch approved. So that's it, guys. I hope this video was useful for you. Tell me what you think about the Sons of Prospero. I'm really interested in your opinion. do you like the book? What do you don't like about it? If you have any questions, please let me know in the comments below, and I'll see you next time.